Mark Woodruff, thank you very much for joining us and for your willingness to share your thoughts and memories about Vietnam, about your service in Vietnam, and about your reflections on Vietnam. Just to get started, when did you were in the Marine Corps? When did you go into the Marine Corps, and why?
So I finished high school, and then I did 2 years at a community college, El Camino Community College.
Ah,
It was called the junior college then,
right, yeah.
with no real set career goals or anything. I was an undeclared major, so one of the subjects I liked was psychology, and that kind of started me on that as a career.
Yeah.
But I'm pretty sure it was April of '67, I joined the Marines, but I was on a delayed entry. I can't remember. It was like 4 to 6 weeks or something.
Okay.
So I did all the paperwork, the physicals and all that. And then they said, well, come back in 6 weeks or whatever it was. And then I reported on the 5th of July to boot camp and all of that. And the reasons for joining, part of it was because I really didn't know what I was getting into.
Yeah.
I didn't come from a military, a family with military background. Yeah. And my knowledge of it was really based on movies and TV shows. And so I probably had a very glamorous or unrealistic view of it.
Yeah.
Not sorry that I did it, because, it opened my eyes to lots of things.
Sure.
But that was me. So, yeah, I thought my first day of boot camp, when there I was, a nice, clean-cut young man, and I had grown-up men in my faces yelling bad words at me. I thought I'd landed on the moon or something, because my family didn't do that. My dad worked in the aircraft industry. My mother was a lifelong school teacher.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that was me.
And this was 67 that you went into the Corps.
Yeah. So I arrived in Vietnam, I want to say around about December 17th, a bit before Christmas.
Of 68?
Of 67.
Oh, 67. Okay.
Yeah. So I was there coincidentally, like weeks before the Tet Offensive happened.
You say when you go into the Corps that you're not sophisticated in terms of the military. You don't know a lot about the military. It's not in your family history, etc. You must have had some general awareness that there was a war going on.
Yeah, for sure. And I read pretty extensively before going in. At the time, they were mainly histories of the Korean War, but I had that kind of knowledge, but nothing firsthand.
Yeah. So, I mean, was there a little bit of a disconnect in your mind then? There's a war going on. I'm going into the Marine Corps, but those two things didn't really connect in your mind. I mean, do you remember it connecting in your mind before you got to boot camp? I'm going into the Marine Corps. There's a war going on. Probably I will get into the war that's going on. Did you make that kind of connection in your mind?
Oh yeah. In fact, from being so naive, that's exactly what I wanted. When there's no guarantees, or at least there wasn't then in the Marine Corps, about what your job would be, but you could, your wish list, you could put 3 things that you would like to be in, military occupational specialties. And I put infantry as my 3 choices, because I figured that would get me to Vietnam. So no, that was something.
Okay. So
that was something I really wanted. And I think, even sitting here right now, I think a lot of it was that I had a sense that, just like my parents' generation, World War II was their rite of passage, or, that was the connection between that generation. I just knew that the Vietnam War was going to be that. And I had no idea that it was going to continue on, but there was a sense of that there was this conflict going on, and I, read about it and everything. Okay. But that it was really, that if I missed that, I was going to miss some significant event that would link me with my peers. And I was kind of right about that.
Oh, that's what I was going to ask you. I mean, it sounds like, that is the case. Were you, sometimes I hear veterans refer back to President Kennedy's famous inaugural address and the famous, ask not what your country can do for you, what you can do for your country. and that very inspiring speech, which is really, I mean, as speeches go, a work of art. Do you remember kind of feeling that same kind of inspiration that coming from that?
Yeah, and I think that, that was kind of where American culture stood for a little while, was in belief with that. And in many ways we did. I mean, going to the moon, there was that sense of patriotism and national unity, progress.
Sure. Yeah. So you did a couple years at the junior college, as it was called at the time, community college, before you went into the Marine Corps?
Yes.
And you knew early on that you were interested in psychology?
Yeah, all I done is like a Psych 101 and a Sociology 101 sort of thing.
Okay.
But yeah, that was kind of in the back of my brain that I would go into something like that.
Yeah.
And I really wasn't sure if it was going to be more sociology or psychology. But, I just knew that I was more of a wordy people kind of guy than, a mathematician or something.
Right, right. What was it about, because you become a psychologist, you make a career in psychology.
Yeah.
But as you look back, at the beginning, what was it about psychology that captured your imagination, that was so interesting to you?
Well, I think I really preferred sociology, but I didn't really want to be a social worker or something like that.
Yeah.
And I really wanted to be to have a practice in whatever I was going to do, not necessarily teach it, because I just don't think I had the background for that.
Yeah.
So I was just fascinated what makes people tick, and it's to this day. I mean, if I'm at a party with my wife, we come back, and you kind of rehash what took place. What did so and so mean when they said that, and just kind of fun. I guess my mother was always a people watcher, your school teacher, but she would go like at the airport while she was waiting for her plane, and she would just watch all the people, and she'd make these little connections like, oh, I see that couple, and I think they're just newly married, and interest in people, what makes them tick.
And did you operate in that mode when you were in Vietnam? Of course, you're very busy. I mean, Foxtrot Ridge, this describes a battle, so I'm assuming you're not sitting around analyzing people at that point. But in sort of did you find yourself kind of in that mode when you're on patrols, like watching the different guys and studying the different guys and so on?
I mean, I didn't have nearly enough academic knowledge about psychology. Again, I just done like a Psych 101 sort of thing.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I think it reflected my personality. So regardless of having some undergraduate studies, I think I would have naturally been interested in how people react to things, because that's just the way I am.
Yeah.
But I kind of looked at that, but not really consciously or anything.
Oh, so the reason I'm asking these questions about psychology is because after you leave Vietnam, and when did you get out of the Marine Corps?
I actually got an early out. So I was scheduled to have not got out for, 4 months or something.
Yeah.
And then because there was an excess of infantry, and if you only had a short period of time left, in my case, I think it was about 4 months, it really wasn't worth the government, Marine Corps, sending you back to Vietnam.
Yeah.
So, you're really kind of sitting there idle, more or less, waiting for your discharge.
Sure.
And so the Marine Corps instituted a series of early out programs. So if you were in a variety of different MOSs, military occupational specialties,
right,
mainly things like infantry,
sure,
that if you were that MOS and you had limited time left, you had the option of being able to leave early, which is why I took that. But it did really interrupt my university applications, because I thought I had plenty of time to apply to different places. But then lo and behold, within about a week's notice, I was getting out like 4 months early. So that's really what led me to go to Pepperdine. They were just very open-minded. And I think, as I recall, I went there on enrollment day.
Was this 69 or 70?
Yeah, 69. I think I probably started Pepperdine in 70.
Yeah, yeah. Since we're here, how was that? How was that adjustment for you? Which I mean is kind of a psychological question. As you describe in your book, Foxtrot Ridge, and we'll look at a couple short passages from that in a few minutes, but you weren't just in Vietnam, and you didn't, I mean, so you're in Vietnam, you're a combat veteran in Vietnam, but you're also a veteran in, you know, an extremely intense, engagement there at Foxtrot Ridge, not far from Khe Sanh in I Corps.
Yep.
So you have that experience, and then, not a whole lot later, now you're in university classrooms in Pepperdine, or at Pepperdine. How did that transition go?
I wasn't aware of it at the time, but looking back, I think I was really disconnected to people. I mean, in the first place, I was that little bit older. So I mean, I had 2 years of junior college, and then whatever it was, probably 2.5, 3 years in the Marine Corps. So in the first place, I was a little bit older than your typical naive first year student. And then the background was really disconnected. Like most things, it's very hard to think about a subject unless you share some context. Just stating that you did something, or if someone asked a question, where were you? I mean, I would give an answer, but because they didn't have the context, we really weren't communicating about anything. It's like speaking a different language.
Sure, yeah.
And the other thing I think is that I really only associated with other infantry people. That was my unit. And so I remember people asking me later about, for instance, did I see much combat? And my typical response was, about the same as everybody else. And it was probably 10 years after that before I realized that I probably saw about as much combat as any other infantry Marine during the Tet Offensive, which is a whole lot.
In I Corps, yeah.
But, I didn't realize that. And so even when I came back from Vietnam and I was sent to Camp Pendleton, I mean, the people I hung around with, other Marines of my same rank, I was a corporal, then a sergeant, we all had the same kind of background. So it's only when I spoke to people that didn't have that background that it started to hit me, what I had really seen. It took me a while to realize that my Vietnam experience was in that way more intense than a lot of people's.
I think that's right, yeah. Were there other combat vets at Pepperdine, or were you kind of on your own?
I was really on my own. But there was my brother-in-law who was finishing up his master's, I think. And he had been drafted into the Army to go to Vietnam. But other than that, really, no. A good buddy that I just kind of linked up with, another psych student, his name was Kelly Ito, and excuse me, he didn't serve in Vietnam, but because he joined the Army just prior to Vietnam, and he was an Army paratrooper, and so we kind of hung out together because he was the same age and he was married and had a young child.
Yeah.
We didn't tell war stories or anything because our experience was really different. But I think there was just inherently, we kind of knew that, we had some experiences that were different from a lot of what struck us at the time as fellow students who had led fairly sheltered existence. Their big adventure was what they were doing, going off to college.
When you were at Pepperdine studying psychology, were you successful in, to use a psychological term, repressing all of that Vietnam stuff? Did you even attempt to do that? Or was it a tape that's constantly kind of playing in the back of your mind, but there's really no one to talk about? Just sort of, what was that like psychologically for you, having these memories that were so radically different from the people around you in class?
I think your latter statement is probably really descriptive. I mean, little things. I can remember one class, psychology class. It may have been doing the master's. I can't remember at what point of Pepperdine it was. Yeah. But there was a role-playing thing, and if anybody's listening to this isn't familiar with role-playing, in psychology, it's kind of a standard little thing about getting people to act out a scene. And so, like, oh, you have to deal with your boss. Let's act this out. And then pretend that I'm the boss and, you're applying for the job, sort of thing.
Yeah.
And this particular thing was about having anger and unexpressed anger for someone. And I still remember there was these things called tacos, probably mispronouncing it, but it was like a big padded spanking paddle, but so padded that you could belt someone with it and it wouldn't really hurt them. And in this role playing, the idea was that everybody had to take turns, was, think of something that really upsets you. This other person will be so you're aggrieved, and the other person is the one who's aggrieved you. Now, take it out on them with this bull taco. Yeah. And, at the time I thought, goodness sakes, if I really wanted to take it out on them, I wouldn't be hitting them with a padded stick. I'd be picking up a big board and taking it out on. So that was kind of one of those clear little images of where the disconnect was, how I knew I was a little different than the rest of them.
At Pepperdine, then you finish your graduate work in psychology, if I have that right. And then how long after that do you move to Australia?
Very, very soon. We had a trimester program at Pepperdine. So I really can't remember exactly what graduation month was, because I was doing all 3 of these trimesters to finish my program as quickly as possible.
Right.
Which kind of translated to not taking a summer break. So I'm going to guess that I graduated and probably moved to Australia 3 or 4 months later, if that. I think having been to Australia on R&R, it wasn't quite the mystery place that it might have been. So I was quite happy to go back and to give it a try to live there. Thinking at the time it would be easier to get a psychology job there. Thinking at the time that I'd just have a nice little life experience for a year or 2 and then come back. But then 35 years later, I was still there.
Wow. So 35 years in Australia.
Yeah.
And I gather, well, in fact, I think I know you did work as a psychologist with the Australian Navy. Is that right? Do I have that?
Yeah. What's funny is that I was really way more of a psychologist than any kind of a military person for most of my time in Australia. I first got a job basically within the education system. And I worked there for, I want to say maybe 20 years or something like that. And really no one had any real interest in Vietnam or military things. So I was just purely psychology. And really, I could kind of forget about my military service. It was only really later that became what it is now is such a more dominant influence. I really went into a real timeout about Vietnam and military service. A lot of it is because Australians weren't really so interested in it. They had troops in Vietnam, but the numbers were far lower, and their casualty rate was lower. So it didn't. They had the anti-war protests. They kind of mirrored the U.S., America, but the filter was on. It was toned down a lot.
Sure.
And so now my conversations with my workmates, fellow psychologists, typically wasn't about wars or military service or anything. It was just, football, you name it.
Wow. Now, did that change though as the years go by? Do you find yourself working more as a psychologist with combat veterans, with military veterans?
Yeah, that was all kind of strange because it started. I'll try to keep this brief, but so you understand. I was really just kind of minding my own business as an educational psychologist, and I went to a conference, and some engineering friends, they were lecturers in engineering. I just got a little note passed to me in this group of people in an auditorium, and the note said, "Would you like to be a Navy psychologist?" And after there was a break, and I said, "What's this all about?" And the Australian Navy was looking for reserve psychologists. This is just before the Gulf War. And there was a feeling at the time that the casualties would be high.
Right.
And so they were really looking for reservists as doctors, psychologists, nurses, and all that thing. And it just sounded like a fun little adventure. And that, kind of kicked it off.
And so you do go into that, and as things develop, then you do find yourself in conversation as a psychologist with combat veterans?
Yeah. And as a reservist, sometimes I stayed a reservist and just did, a couple of days a week. Other times I would sign on to the full-time Navy for designated periods of time to do things. One of the main things for Navy psychology, in Australia at least, is dealing with PTSD.
Yeah. So when you, as a psychologist, when you are talking with combat veterans, you're relating with them, obviously, psychologist, client, or whatever the right term is.
Yeah, yeah.
But did you also relate to them as a fellow combat vet? I mean, did you let them know, hey, I'm a psychologist, but I'm also a combat vet? So
I didn't. It's funny. Usually it was known. They knew about it before they saw me.
okay.
I never really made a point of that because, that's that kind of thing about, I know you're going through something bad. I know exactly how you feel, which is forbidden for psychologists.
Not true, yeah.
To talk about, I understand your grief. I've had grief also.
Right.
So I didn't do that, but generally speaking, people knew about it. The Bush Telegraph, previous clients would say, oh yeah, this guy.
So I wanted to ask you, given your experience, not only as a combat veteran, but as a psychologist, I wanted to hear your thoughts on a couple passages in Foxtrot Ridge. And one of the things I wonder, and I know going into this question that it's unanswerable, meaning that there's no way to convey what's in your head to another person completely, right? Well, but the question I have is, what do combat vets do with the kinds of memories that are described in this book? And so one of the passages that really struck me comes from Lance Corporal Alan Chief Walker, Chief being the nickname. He describes NVA, North Vietnamese Army soldiers coming up to where the Marines are. And here's what he says. He says, then you could just hear them. And I ain't kidding you, that was the worst feeling of all. To hear the grass breaking and snapping, to hear them dragging themselves and their equipment up the hill. And you could hear them talking. That was so nerve-wracking. There were lots of them. You just heard the labored breathing all up and down and in front of us. And then he goes on and says, boy, I tell you, my heart really sank then. I was really afraid. I mean, we all were. You could just hear them. You could hear their canteens. You could hear their cartridge belts dragging stuff. And that's pretty powerful.
Very.
And it's helpful, to have been to that part of Vietnam, and you can imagine the terrain and the sort of, the grass and all of that. As a combat veteran, as a psychologist, I mean, in day-to-day life, what do combat Vietnam veterans do with those kinds of memories? So even as we speak in my city here, there are Vietnam vets at the local store who are buying shampoo or bread. They've got on their Vietnam veteran hat, and they're looking around and, all the nonsense going on in the world today. But they've got these memories,
Yeah.
So I don't even know if the question even makes sense, but I'm just interested in hearing you kind of respond to that, both as a combat vet and as a psychologist. Like, what are these, what does the vet do with these memories? What do these memories do to the veteran? And go for it any way.
Great. I'll make comments, although I'm not sure how right I am about this, but
yeah,
my gut feeling is that most, I'd say combat veterans, but you could also talk about, anyone that's been in a car accident, for instance, anyone who's experienced those kind of high intensity things. So let's stick with with the combat veterans, I think on the particularly high intensity events, like what Chief Walker was just describing, I think that they usually are very visceral and they serve as real triggers. And often, well, like in Chief's case, he's describing a lot of auditory things, sounds. But others will be, it might be a particular smell, particular odor. A lot of times combat veterans will talk about, after you're mortared or whatever, there's that lingering smell of gunpowder from the explosions.
Sure.
Or, whatever. It could have been a rainy day that something happened. So they have those triggers that, like in Chief Walker's example, I'm going to guess that day to day he doesn't think about it, but every so often there'll be a noise that he'll hear that's going to trigger that. And it might be the sound of, the way he's describing it. It could be the water sloshing around in a jug that reminds him of the sound that he heard of the water in the NBA canteens. And I think that's, when you say, how do you deal with it? How do you work through it? I think that's the way most of us do it, is that doesn't change, but generally it's not the overwhelming focus of our day. But something will happen and it'll take you right back there and you'll just remember it. Like with Chief, I would say that he doesn't, spend 24 hours a day thinking about that, but probably once a day, every other day, something will happen and it'll just take him back there.
Is that the case for you? Are there particular things that bring you back perhaps to Foxtrot Ridge itself or to some other aspect of your service in Vietnam?
Yeah. And I don't know if I know them all that well myself, but there are. And I mean, as a weird example, I was living in Australia at the time and my son and I were camping, kind of really roughing it. And I just smelled, danger. And, we were way out in the country. And I told him to get down, and it was like, I knew there was danger really close. And I kind of very tentatively went to investigate it. And it was a dead kangaroo. But the smell was that, the carcass. And that was often a smell of Vietnam.
Wow.
Because there were enemy bodies lying around, and it wasn't unusual to be on a patrol and find an isolated dead NBA soldier who might have been there, basically rotting for weeks.
Yeah.
And so there was that smell, olfactory trigger. But, I think there's a lot of those.
I mean, one of the things you often hear is the sound of helicopters.
Yep.
That sort of thing.
Helicopters, to me, I usually wasn't badly aware of those. But after I was finished with Vietnam, but before I went to Pepperdine, I was at Camp Pendleton, and I went to stay with my family, on a weekend. And I guess I didn't have a car at the time, whatever. So my mother kindly volunteered to drive me back to Camp Pendleton on a Monday morning or Sunday night or whatever. And it used to be, there was an air base that's since closed, El Toro Marine Corps Air Base.
Yeah.
Kind of around about where Disneyland is right now. And I still remember that we were driving along, and I guess it was a Phantom jet that either was taking off or landing.
Oh, boy.
But my mother told me later, she said, I just went white. And, that would have been, like Foxtrot Ridge, the planes coming in, dropping napalm and things.
Wow. And is that almost like I don't think autonomic response is the correct phrase, but is it something like that where it's not a thought process, it's just something, it's almost like, the training kicks in, the stereotype is, the guy comes back from Iraq, car backfires, and the next thing he's dived, he's crawled under another car and not thinking about it, just instant response, that sort of thing. Yeah, I
think so. Yeah, I like Kurt Vonnegut. I think it was in Slaughterhouse-Five. One of his characters, which is kind of based on him, is a World War II veteran, and he describes this veteran as thinking with his spinal cord, just reacting to sounds and doing things.
Yeah. It's a great, well, it's not quite a memoir. It's sort of an oral history of the battle, and I
Yeah.
encourage folks to read it. I mean, among other things, you mentioned that you have air support that comes in. They drop napalm, but it's extremely close. One of the passages where you're quoting yourself, you say, "My pack and my cartridge belt had been lying right behind my hole." The cartridge belt, they were made out of that heavy canvas, and they had all these little brass eyelets to attach gear to. Well, that had just disappeared, right? The fire had consumed everything but
Yeah.
metal, and so that napalm comes in so close. There are other powerful moments. The Battle of Foxtrot Ridge, this is May 1968, right? If I had
Correct.
it right, May 68. 13 killed, 44 wounded. Out of how many Marines did you start with?
88.
88. So 13 killed, 44 wounded. So we're what, approaching 60% casualties, something like
Yeah,
that?
something like that. There
Right.
was only a real handful that walked down off the ridge. So the non-wounded simply walked down. We were relieved by Echo Company, another company of Marines, and we simply walked off. And yes, there was just a handful.
And were you one of those?
Yeah, I was. Yeah, I was not wounded on Foxtrot Ridge. I was wounded previously, but not Foxtrot Ridge.
Yeah. Can you tell us briefly about the wound?
Yeah, this was, in fact, just after the Tet Offensive, and it was an operation called Operation Ford. And essentially, it was around a little bit south of Quezon, more around Phu Bai, and
Hmm.
it was to really mop up the survivors who had attacked Way City. And so our job was to cut off these returning NVA. And yeah, we got some of them out in the open. There was just 4 or 5 of them. And so we were patrolling along, and uh, yeah, we just kind of caught them sitting there on a little gravestone. So I guess they were supposed to be standing guard, but they were just chatting amongst themselves. And they attempted to escape. And unfortunately for them, they tried to escape along, like paralleling the way we were strung out. And so we just kind of turned and fired and killed them. One of them we only wounded. We were able to get him medical care. But then kind of started a battle. And then I was hit with grenade fragments.
Wow. How badly were you wounded?
Well, looking back, it wasn't bad, but it was arterial. So I got some shrapnel in my arm, just about in my, you know, yeah, in my arm. And it happened to hit the artery. And so the blood was really pumping out. There's a big explosion.
Yeah.
Another Marine by the name of Tyler was knocked back, and he fell backwards. He was wearing his helmet, so he fell back into his helmet. And I really wasn't even aware so much that I was hit because of the explosion, and you're scared and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And I just knew that my arm, in fact, I think it was my leg, got really warm. I looked down at my arm and I'm just pumping blood.
Wow.
Uh, it turned out, I was medevaced, of course, but it turned out it was a very minor injury. I mean, it was a little tiny BB-sized thing, but it hit right in my artery.
Mm.
And, as I discovered later, it's still terribly dangerous because you can bleed out with an arterial wound very quickly.
Wow. So last question related to this, and then we'll move on to a portion of your other book on Unheralded Victory, or of the other book that we'll discuss here. But you've described, enemy bodies that you just come across in the context of that war in northern South Vietnam. Here at Foxtrot Ridge, we have the casualties, 13 killed, 44 wounded. You just described this battle or this firefight, and you said it very plainly. We killed them, and I mean, so for me, those are words. For you, these are actual memories. A question I often ask vets, although it's been some time since I've asked a combat veteran, if I had a potion that I could give to you, and the potion would wipe all of those memories out, the smell of death, the memories of the NVA soldiers being killed in a firefight, the memory of your own fellow Marines being killed and severely wounded at Foxtrot Ridge and other places. If I could give you a potion to wipe all of that from your memory, would you drink it?
No, in fact, I don't even really have to think too much about that. No, because that's what makes me what I am today. And I think that's me. But most people could look at their lives and think that there was some unpleasant times or whatever. But that really is what has developed what they are at the moment. So I think if I took that magic potion, I wouldn't recognize myself.
Now, the other book, Unheralded Victory, that's before Foxtrot Ridge, is that right?
Yes. Yes.
Before. And part 3 is what I wanted to focus on, because it's a book that I wish that I had been familiar with years before, because it would have been so useful in my class, because it challenges so many of the what I think are now just sort of assumptions about the war, things that are just taken as gospel. And I think you very effectively challenge a number of these things. And so I want to turn to that. My interpretation of Unheralded Victory is that you make the case that the United States clearly won the military war. The Viet Cong were absolutely devastated after Tet, and I think most people, recognize that.
Yeah.
The NVA was also defeated. The war, the United States clearly won, along with its allies, clearly won the Vietnam War. But it seems that you suggest that the U.S. lost the psychological war. It won the military war and it lost the psychological war. Is that an accurate?
Yeah, I think I'm not alone in that feeling. You have to be careful because sometimes, there's a real air of sour grapes about that. But even having said that, I think it's true that, and of course you can also argue that the military victories didn't matter because the other side prevailed. And it's so easy to see why when one side is really focusing on all the mistakes, and that's what makes things newsworthy is mistakes, bizarre events, and whatever, and naysayers. So one side is telling that, and the other side has just got a narrow-minded focus about saying that we are right, we're doing it correctly, and we're winning every battle. And we're just a Western country is just set up to fail in those two communications.
You have one system, North Vietnam, highly controlled. You've got student protesters in South Vietnam. You don't, I don't think, have student protesters in North Vietnam. That's not allowed. Yeah. You have free speech is operational in the United States and Australia. In South Vietnam, in the newspapers, I don't think that's the case in the North.
Right.
So the North just, there's a lot less that it has to spend its energy on, right? It's
and it's, I think it's just the nature of media. I mean, we see it all the time is that you turn on the news and it's not going to be necessarily even the most significant events. The news will tell you about what bizarre things happened. A car hits a fire hydrant and there's water, or there's flooding somewhere. These aren't huge stories, but we're just naturally attracted to bizarre things.
Right.
And I think a lot of the reporting about Vietnam was like that. It's focused on the mistakes. If there was an American operation that went perfectly, it would hardly be in the news.
The famous instances that come to mind from the Tet Offensive, the photograph of, is it General Luan, with, and the Viet Cong. And of course, the backstory, as you say in your book, is, that Viet Cong had just murdered a family, if I have it correctly.
Yeah.
Which, doesn't necessarily excuse what happened, but it provides context. As you say, context is important. The context gets
Yeah.
lost. I think you talk about it in your book, and others mentioned as well. The journalists are primarily in Saigon, and they are scared, right? And, therefore, what happens at the embassy in Saigon becomes this major story.
Yeah.
But there are all kinds, and that ends up being a defeat for the Viet Cong too.
Yeah.
But you look at the newsreel and you listen to the tones of the voices of the journalists, and it doesn't feel like it's a victory.
Yeah.
And then you've got all of these military successes. The Viet Cong are being decimated throughout South Vietnam, and that doesn't get through. There's this bizarre. I mean, tell me if you disagree with me, but there's this bizarre feeling by the time we get to mid-February 68 that we've experienced this great catastrophe in South Vietnam, when actually militarily that's not the case at all. The opposite is true. Is that right?
Yeah, I think, and I think historians have kind of moved toward that view. Yeah. And they'll set them apart as two different things, as military versus political or media war.
In part 3 of Unheralded Victory, you focus on, I don't know if I have the pronunciation correct, but the Dick Van, is that right?
That'll do. Yeah, I'm not sure either, but yeah.
Program. Yeah. What was that? And, you spent a fair amount of time, working away at a number of elements of this program.
Yeah.
But what was it, and what do you think, looking back, were the most important elements of that program? So first, what was it, and then what do you think were the most important elements of it?
Well, I think it was a conscious effort to in disseminating information, and we might call it propaganda.
And this is from the North Vietnamese government.
Yeah, the message that they sent out, they really had several. And some of their message was to their own people about how, America is in the wrong, you name any of that. And so some of that is meant for them, but a lot of it was consciously directed at their enemy, us. And it was to undermine their enemy. And so they had a thought out plan to do that.
To turn the openness of the United States against itself, or to take advantage of the openness of the United States.
Yeah. I hadn't thought about it before, but it's a little bit like the 9/11 terrorists. You could take the openness of America, the freedom to fly, and use that vehicle against us, use our own systems against us.
Yeah. Looking back, what do you think were the most important elements of that? In what ways was the North Vietnamese government successful in taking advantage of the openness of the United States?
Well, being able to put the message there, even though it wasn't true. I mean, the typical veteran in Vietnam did not go there to harm civilians, to kill babies, do anything like that, and didn't have any experience of that at all. And yet that was kind of one of the themes that would run through protests and public gatherings. I mean, even if you look at, and this is, they're all just baby killers or whatever. Yeah. I mean, I actually had a person that I knew from high school ask me how many babies I killed. This was probably in 1969 or something. And I just, gave him that look like, are you crazy? You're talking to me. I don't do that.
Right. Yeah. Sort of the idea that My Lai was rather than being this aberration, which therefore gets a lot of news, as you said, sort of the bizarre story gets the attention. My Lai is terrific. Everyone agrees about that.
Yeah.
Kind of this sense bubbles, works its way into the culture, into historical memory, that My Lai somehow is a representative.
Oh, yeah. And then it becomes contagious, because then people will write a fictional book about Vietnam, and often they'll have to throw in the obligatory scene that somehow reflects that, because that's what they think Vietnam was. And so they'll have a fictional character do something like that. I mean, if you look at something like Platoon, you know, some authors will build in these falsehoods. And so it just keeps reinforcing that, oh, I mean, it must have happened. You know, I heard about My Lai, I saw this movie, even though it was fiction, I saw that.
Right. Yeah. You quote in the book, you quote David Horowitz, who at that time was a radical anti-war protester. Let me see, editor of the radical anti-war movement's journal Ramparts during those years, later acknowledged, so this is David Horowitz, "Let me make this perfectly clear. Those of us who inspired and then led the anti-war movement did not want just to stop killing or stop the killing, as so many veterans of those domestic battles now claim. We wanted the communists to win."
Yeah, yeah. And if you're a soldier or a Marine, that kind of translates to they would prefer me dead.
Is this something you think now, did you think it then, that in Vietnam, you had, I think in Foxtrot Ridge we're focused on NVA, but you've got NVA forces, you've got Viet Cong.
Yeah.
Then you have the elements, the mosquitoes, the incredible heat, the humidity where you almost feel like you're drowning at times, the rain, the sweat, the mud, what are those things that get on you? And
The leeches.
The leeches, right? Yeah, which a lot of folks write about. So you've got all these sorts of enemies, right? But looking back and or at the time, did you also feel that there was kind of an enemy, a class of enemies back in your own country as well?
I wasn't as aware of it when I was there. Later on, I saw that, but we were so cut off from communication. Typically, we didn't have we had a radio to communicate with the platoon and things. Yeah. But once in a while, somebody would have a transistor radio, but you couldn't really play it loud, and everything got ruined by the wet. I mean, remember, this was before Ziploc bags even.
Right, yeah.
Almost anything electronic or anything, cigarettes, everything would get damp. So we didn't really listen to that. And certainly there was no TV to watch. And so we were kind of blissfully unaware of that. Yeah. That there was, a significant part of the American population that was actively in the enemy's corner and actively wanting us to lose. And to lose means killed or wounded.
Wow. When this, I think you said a former classmate asked you, how many babies you killed? Was the question somehow innocent but profoundly ignorant, or was it hostile, or what was the?
I think it was more hostile. I think it was probably born out of ignorance, but it's.
How did you respond?
Profound here, but it's it's not what you'd ask someone.
Sure. How did you respond to that?
Well, I think I was just shocked that I would be asked that. And then I think I just said, no, of course not. None. I don't really recall, but I may have said, what made you ask that question?
Wow, yeah.
But that was a popular image. I've read many times that Lyndon Johnson, one of the reasons he didn't run was because he was just sick of the protesters saying, hey, LBJ, how many babies have you killed today? Mm-hmm. And he was, he had civil rights, a lot of really important things that he wanted to do. But he just got brought down by that public image of him as being a mercenary, horrible, bad person. And I don't think he was.
I think what was so useful to me, and I think what would be useful to others is, some of the points you make that are very interesting. So, for example, what are the images we have in our minds? Popular images, the Vietnam combatant, Army, Marine, out in the boonies as the, relentless drug abuser. And one of the interesting points you make is that if you actually look at the numbers, they were smoking more dope at Columbia University than we were smoking out in the field.
Yeah. Yeah. And, Marines, combat soldiers, you know, are not stupid. And, they may have not had any objection to marijuana or whatever. But, when your life depends on it, you're not going to permit that to happen, with your fellow troops.
Right. And I think you make the point that, to the extent that drugs were a problem, and everyone acknowledges they were there, but to an extent that drugs were a problem, it was primarily in the rear echelon, right? Where,
Yeah.
right, obviously when you're out on patrol, I mean, I just don't imagine that a group of Marines out on patrol are really going to tolerate a fellow Marine.
Absolutely. And, the other thing is out in the bush, in the boonies, there was no access to drugs, even if you wanted them.
Yeah.
I mean, we didn't interact with civilians typically around Quezon. They'd been moved out.
Yeah.
It was what they call a free fire zone, really. So there was just combatants, our side and their side. So if someone wanted drugs, good luck. I have no idea how they would get them.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. They wouldn't be tolerated either.
Sure. So it's just an example of, the importance of making distinctions, of being able to make distinctions. And, I thought it was a useful point that you show the numbers that, more kids at the elite universities were getting stoned than were the Marines and the soldiers out in the boonies of Vietnam. Another point you make, which I think is very interesting, is, of course, another famous image of the war is the American going north into Canada, and of course that did happen. If I remember correctly, you show the numbers that more Canadians actually, in terms of hard numbers, you have more Canadians fighting with American forces in Vietnam than you do Americans who went to Canada, which is something I knew that Canadians served in American forces, but I had no idea.
Yeah, well, even with that little microcosm of Foxtrot Company and Foxtrot Ridge, one of the characters, the real Marines I talk about, is Kevin Howell. And he was up on the Crow's Nest where it's very intense fighting, and he is a Canadian citizen.
Yeah.
He is a veteran of, I think it was the Canadian Air Force. It could have been Army. I can't remember.
Yeah.
But yeah, as soon as he could, he came south and joined the Marines.
Yeah. Respond to this, because I think, just another point you make, I found it so interesting. And again, I wish that I had been familiar with this, years before. Because one of the things you hear, and one of the things that came out of my own mouth, teaching the class was, the U.S. dropped more tonnage of bombs on Vietnam than, and then you hear different things, than the entire Second World War or something like that. I don't remember. But the idea is, just the massive tonnage of bombs that got dropped on Vietnam, which might be, technically true, but I think you point out in your book, but it's actually a little more complicated than that, or there's context that's missing when you make that simplistic statement. So what is the context there?
Well, the context is that except for a very, very limited period of time, places like Hanoi were off limits. There was very strict rules of engagement, and almost all of that tonnage of bombs dropped was in unpopulated areas. Like the Ho Chi Minh Trail kind of wrapped around Laos, right, and then into Vietnam, which was the way they came in to attack Foxtrot Ridge. And so the only people there on these, it's called a trail, but it was more like a highway almost, were enemy combatants. And they dropped a ton of tonnage, not a ton, but tons and tons of bombs, because in those days we didn't have smart weapons. And if you're just dropping them hoping to hit something, you had to drop a lot of bombs back in the day.
Sure. And we are, added to that, we are talking about, I think everyone agrees, a remarkably resilient and inventive adversary. And you hear it a lot that the bridge gets bombed out, and 3 days later they've built another bridge, which means here come the bombs again.
Yeah.
So in terms of raw numbers, we have maybe more bomb tonnage, but here we get to the importance of distinctions. There is no equivalent of Dresden in the Vietnam War. There is no equivalent of Nagasaki or Hiroshima
or even Tokyo. Yep.
Or even Tokyo in the Vietnam War. So these are important distinctions. Why do you think that these complicating but really important factors are not part of the discussion when we think about the Vietnam War?
I don't know, but I haven't thought about it except what I'm about to say is, I wonder how many other conflicts or events or whatever that, even if we think we know, we sit around and we talk about it, but because we don't have the context or the basics right, that maybe, every human event is like that we go around thinking we understand it until we pull out the magnifying glass or the microscope and look at it more closely.
That's true. I do tell my students that often you can say things that are kind of true at the general level, but almost inevitably when you get to the ground level and start looking at details, things start getting a lot more complicated. And also,
I remember when I started off doing the Vietnam Unheralded Victory, which is really much more of an academic history kind of a thing. I'm not there in the first person anywhere.
Right.
And one of the things I realized I was doing is, it's the old story about, they say, if you pick up a diamond or a crystal or something, you can look at it, you can twist it, and every time you twist it a bit or put different light on, it becomes a little different. You see new things. And so a lot of what I was doing in that book was just to pick up a fact, whatever it was, and then see if I could twist it around, look at it, and does it look different with a different perspective?
What do you think people today should know about the war? What do you think young people today should know about the Vietnam War? So just imagine yourself, coming into a classroom and you've been given the last 5 minutes of a class session. It's a very general question. What do you think these 18, 19, 20-year-olds should know about the Vietnam War or about that era?
Well, probably in brief, I would think that the important thing to think about is to give the participants, that's the leaders from the President of the United States on down, to give them, just for interest's sake, give them the benefit of the doubt and think, what if they were well-intentioned? What if they were really doing the best they could, given the knowledge they had, whether that was a general leading a battle or whatever? I mean, if you start with that view that's not very cynical and negative, then your whole view of everything in Vietnam really switches. I mean, for a while, there was this pervasive view that generals didn't care about their troops and, body counts and whatever. But, really, when you look at it, generals are always far more miserly about losing their troops than politicians are. Politicians are more likely to say, yes, let's have the war, and the generals are more likely to be dragging their feet. Right. So I think, to me, that was a fundamental difference. I was probably 25 or 30 or something like that when I realized that a lot of it took the most negative view of every event, and that was the way it was spun. And it just turns everything on its head if you say, hold on, maybe McNamara wasn't mindless to casualties. Maybe he really cared about his troops, but he was in a war and he had to, make choices. I don't know. It just changes everything.
I agree with you. So what you're doing is encouraging folks to begin with a charitable disposition.
Good description.
Which doesn't mean that you don't end up critiquing and criticizing, but you begin with a charitable disposition, which, leads me to reflect on, what was the motivation in the first place? The motivation in the first place never was to make a colony of South Vietnam or to make a colony of Vietnam, North or South.
Yeah.
The motivation always was to stop. I mean, correct me if you think I'm wrong, but the motivation always was to stop in its tracks an ideology that by that point already had a proven record, not just of repression on a huge scale, but of mass murder.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's a matter of historical record that this is what communism has done every time it's been forced on a population from the top down. Of course, you can have voluntary communist systems, monasteries, etc. So to begin with that disposition, that the purpose was not to drop bombs on a country far away because there was nothing else interesting to do.
Yeah.
But there was a truly horrible, repressive, and deadly on a mass scale ideology out there that was spreading.
Yeah.
And the goal was to liberate people in a tiny part of the world from that and to push back.
I think that's fair. That was the aim. Yeah.
That was the aim.
And if you talk to Vietnamese veterans, I think that's pretty much the view they take as well. You know, after the fall of Saigon, of course, Australia had the boat people because that's easy access from Malaysia and places.
Sure.
And we had the same thing here in the U.S. And, you know, if you look at those people that were escaping, you know, that's clearly their message. And if you talk to them now, they even, that's the way they view it.
Thank you very much for the books, and thank you for this time. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. God bless you.
Great, thank you.